For centuries, the Catholic Church defined not only faith, but also the boundaries of acceptable thought. In a world where books were the main source of knowledge, control over texts meant control over how people perceived reality. Some texts became canon, while others disappeared from circulation or were placed under prohibition. But the most intriguing thing is not the fact of the prohibition itself, but what exactly was being rejected. If we look more closely at these texts, it begins to feel as though this was not simply a struggle against heresy or alternative opinions. Many of them offered another way of understanding the world and humanity's role within it, as if there were parallel models of reality that, for certain reasons, were never meant to become widely accessible. The book known as the Key of Solomon has been surrounded by an atmosphere of mystery from the very beginning, not only because of its content, but also because of its uncertain origin. It is associated with the biblical King Solomon, to whom tradition attributes power over spirits and access to hidden laws of the world. Yet the text itself appeared much later and has no direct historical connection to him. This gap between legend and reality creates the impression that the book is not merely a work of its time, but the bearer of something deeper and hidden. Its mystery is intensified by the fact that the text exists in multiple versions and manuscripts that differ in details, as though it were not one complete work, but fragments of knowledge that were passed down and altered over centuries. The rituals, symbols, and seals described in it are presented as tools for interacting with unseen forces. Yet they also resemble a system that requires deep understanding and inner preparation, reinforcing the sense of access to secret knowledge. In various interpretations, the idea often appears that such texts may not simply be products of medieval tradition, but could partly preserve the legacy of a much older and unknown source. Supporters of such theories suggest that the Key of Solomon may have preserved fragments of knowledge originating from some lost or little-known civilization, whose understanding of the world may have differed greatly from our own. In this view, the book is seen as a bridge between eras, where symbols and rituals may be not only mystical practices, but encoded descriptions of knowledge whose meaning has been partly lost or distorted over time. In the Key of Solomon, rituals, symbols, names, and sequences of actions are described that supposedly allow a person to come into contact with invisible forces. At first glance, this looks like magic or superstition. But on closer inspection, it resembles a kind of system. Symbols, words, and actions function like a code that opens access to a hidden layer of reality. It brings us closer to the boundary between what is permitted and what is hidden, to a place where another reality is not merely described, but where a method of interacting with it is proposed. This is not a narrative, but rather an instruction manual, and that is what makes the text especially controversial. But what if these rituals are a simplified form of knowledge about interacting with invisible processes? Perhaps they were expressed in the symbolic language of their time. In that case, ritual is not merely belief, but an attempt to exert influence. If even part of this has some basis, then humanity's role changes. A person ceases to be merely an observer and receives a tool, the ability to act without intermediaries. And that may be exactly what provoked rejection, because such an idea makes the individual less dependent. A person who believes they can influence reality independently is harder to control. Such a person begins to search, to question, to go beyond what is permitted. And this threatens not only spiritual authority, but also secular authority. The Lesser Key of Solomon develops this idea and makes it even more concrete. In this text, the invisible world is described as a structured system. Demons do not appear chaotic or meaningless. They have functions, knowledge, and specializations. This creates the impression that what we are seeing is not merely mythology, but an attempt to describe some hidden structure of reality. What is especially unsettling is that these beings are said to be able to transmit knowledge. And this knowledge does not always appear evil or destructive. On the contrary, it can be useful, even attractive. This raises a difficult question. What if the sources of knowledge are far broader than we are taught to believe? If that is the case, then the entire system based on a clear division between allowed and forbidden begins to look like an oversimplification. And perhaps that is why such texts inspired fear. They did not merely offer different information. They offered a different picture of the world, in which a person could independently explore the unknown. The Red Dragon is an occult book that describes how one might supposedly summon demons and compel them to fulfill human desires. The text presents rituals, special symbols, incantations, and detailed instructions on how to establish contact with supernatural forces and even enter into agreements with them, most often with the figure of Lucifer. The origin of the Red Dragon is shrouded not only in historical uncertainty, but also in an entire layer of conspiratorial interpretations that give the text even greater mystical weight. Officially, it is associated with 18th century France, but supporters of alternative theories believe this is merely the surface level of the story, a kind of wrapper concealing a much deeper and older source. According to one such theory, the Red Dragon was not created by humans in the ordinary sense, but is instead a compilation of knowledge originating from a much older civilization that supposedly existed before the cultures known to us and left behind fragments of a techno-mystical understanding of the world. In this interpretation, grimoires are seen as attempts to translate into human language a system of interaction with invisible forces that was once part of a more complete body of knowledge. Another widespread conspiratorial idea is that such books did not appear and spread by chance, but may have been intentionally preserved and passed down through closed circles, orders, secret societies, or initiatory schools. In this view, the Red Dragon is seen not as a random text, but as a tool used to transmit knowledge between generations, hidden from the general public under the guise of forbidden magic. Finally, there is an even more mystical interpretation, according to which such texts were not written in the usual sense, but rather received through certain practices, as if their content had been transmitted from an invisible source beyond ordinary human experience. In this view, the Red Dragon appears as a kind of channel of knowledge that opens to those prepared to read it and closes to those who see it merely as a historical artifact. The Red Dragon is often seen as an extreme and even frightening text. Its imagery is sharp and provocative, creating the impression that this is not simply a book, but something best left untouched. But if we strip away the outer form, another interpretation emerges. At its core, the text appears to be an attempt to describe a shortcut to results, a way to bypass a long and difficult process and obtain what one desires more quickly. And once again, the same idea emerges. What if this is not merely about dark forces, but about ancient concepts of hidden mechanisms for influencing reality? Perhaps such knowledge could not be transmitted directly, so it was wrapped in symbols, fear, and warnings. And what if, despite their controversial nature, such texts partially encode another model of reality, one that hints at the existence of processes outside the conventional picture of the world? A reality in which intention, word, action, or a specific sequence may have far greater influence than is commonly believed? A person who allows for the possibility of hidden knowledge or a hidden reality begins to see the world differently. They rely less on ready-made explanations Search more and question more. And that kind of person becomes less dependent on any system. Apocrypha, that is, non-canonical religious texts, reveal a far more complex and multidimensional picture of early Christianity than is usually imagined. They show that in the beginning it was not one unified and clearly defined system, but rather a field of diverse ideas, interpretations, and experiences. It resembled not a monolith, but a network of roads, each leading to understanding by different paths. This gives rise to an uncomfortable but logical thought. What if the canon is merely one of those paths that eventually became dominant? Viewed more broadly, canon can be compared to an official map of a city. It is convenient, understandable, and shows the main routes. But that does not mean that other streets do not exist. In that sense, apocryphal texts are the hidden alleys, not marked on the map, but capable of leading to entirely different places. And perhaps that is why they were removed. Not necessarily because they were false, but because they complicated the overall picture. This becomes especially clear when comparing specific events described in apocryphal texts with the canonical Gospels. For example, in the canonical texts, emphasis is placed on the public ministry of Jesus, his teachings, miracles, and the gradual unfolding of his mission leading to the passion and resurrection. In apocryphal texts, by contrast, the emphasis is often on hidden knowledge and inner revelations. In some Gnostic Gospels, Jesus conveys secret teachings to his disciples after the resurrection that are not intended for the general public. The Gospel of Judas especially demonstrates this difference in interpreting a key event: betrayal. In the canonical Gospels, Judas Iscariot is portrayed as the one who betrays Jesus to the authorities for 30 pieces of silver, leading to his arrest. In the apocryphal text, however, this act is presented differently. Judas appears to act at Jesus' instruction, fulfilling a role necessary for the unfolding of events related to the liberation of the Spirit. Thus, the same event is interpreted either as betrayal or as part of a divine plan. Another example is the role of Mary Magdalene. In the canonical Gospels, she appears as a follower of Jesus and one of the first witnesses of the resurrection. In the Gospel of Mary, she is portrayed as the bearer of special knowledge and even as an authority among the disciples, which causes tension. This text emphasizes her ability to receive and transmit spiritual understanding, contrasting with the canonical emphasis on apostolic hierarchy. Another difference concerns the origin of the world. In the canonical tradition, creation is associated with one God as the good creator. In some apocryphal texts, especially Gnostic ones, a more complex cosmology appears in which the material world may have been created through intermediary beings rather than directly by the highest deity. This creates a different picture of reality in which the material world is not necessarily viewed as the direct and perfect creation of God. These differences are not merely theological. They concern the very mode of thinking. The canonical Gospels emphasize historical events, communal testimony, and external authority. Apocryphal texts shift the focus toward inner experience, hidden knowledge, and multiple layers of reality. This leads to the thought that perhaps these books were forbidden not only because they contained dangerous ideas, but because they could inspire people to believe in their own power and to explore the unknown. And that threatened not only spiritual authority, but secular authority as well, since the two often work together. After all, a person who believes in themselves and allows for the existence of hidden knowledge or another reality is far less inclined to submit. And perhaps the greatest mystery of these texts lies not in what they contain, but in how they affect consciousness. They do not provide ready-made answers, but they open the possibility of asking questions. And questions are always the beginning of a search. Perhaps it was the search itself, rather than the knowledge, that authorities most wanted to restrict. So what do you think about these forbidden books? Why were they really banned? Share your thoughts in the comments. Also, if you enjoyed this video, support it with a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and we will see you again soon on our channel.